There's a very specific moment in almost every relationship with a narcissist where the carefully maintained performance finally starts to crack. Not through some dramatic confrontation, but through small, almost accidental slips that reveal something the earlier version of them worked very hard to keep hidden. Today we're breaking down 3 specific, shocking signs that mark this exact moment, the point where the true personality underneath years of charm, image management, and careful self-presentation finally starts becoming visible, sometimes even to people who've known them for a very long time. Let's set up something important before going through the 3 signs, because understanding why this reveal happens at all changes how you interpret it when it starts appearing. A narcissist's public performance. The charm, the charisma, the carefully curated image requires enormous, continuous effort to maintain. It isn't effortless, even though it often looks that way. This performance is sustained through active management, managing how they're perceived, managing which behaviors get shown to which audiences, managing the gap between how they actually feel and how they present themselves in any given moment. Like any sustained performance, this management has limits, and those limits tend to get tested and eventually breached under specific conditions. Extended stress, loss of control, or simply enough time spent around someone who's stopped being useful enough to warrant continued careful management. The first shocking sign, their reaction to losing control of a narrative in real time in front of witnesses becomes visibly disproportionate to the actual stakes involved. This is one of the most reliable tells because it reveals something the carefully managed public performance was specifically designed to conceal: how genuinely intolerable it is for this person to not be the one controlling how a situation gets perceived. Watch what happens when a narcissist is corrected on a minor factual point in front of other people, about something with essentially no real stakes attached. The healthy expected response, a shrug, a simple acknowledgement, moving on, often gets replaced with something startlingly intense. Prolonged defensiveness, a subtle but unmistakable shift in tone, sometimes outright hostility directed at whoever made the correction, wildly out of proportion to the actual trivial nature of what was being corrected. This reaction is shocking specifically because it reveals the gap between the performance and the reality underneath it so clearly. The carefully maintained image says, confident, secure, unbothered by small things. The actual reaction, once it finally surfaces, says something completely different. Unable to tolerate even minor loss of narrative control, regardless of how insignificant the actual content of that narrative happens to be. Once you've witnessed this disproportionate reaction even once, in a moment when the stakes were genuinely trivial, it becomes almost impossible to unsee the same underlying fragility in every subsequent interaction, even the ones where the careful performance manages to hold. The second shocking sign, a sudden, often startling shift in how they treat people who no longer serve any strategic purpose to them, witnessed directly rather than simply heard about secondhand. This is different from simply hearing that a narcissist treated a previous partner or a former friend badly. That kind of secondhand account can always be explained away, minimized, attributed to the other person's side of a complicated story you weren't present for. This sign is different because you witness it directly. Watching them interact with a service worker who can't do anything for them, watching them discuss someone who's fallen out of their social usefulness, watching their tone and attention shift in real time, the moment they realize a specific person in the room has nothing left to offer them. This is shocking precisely because it's so specific and so immediate. The charm that seemed so genuine, so warmly directed at you, suddenly reveals itself as conditional, visible, in exactly the moments where someone else has become functionally invisible to them. Watching this happen even once tends to produce a very specific, disorienting recalibration, a sudden, uncomfortable awareness that the warmth you've been receiving may have always been contingent on your own continued usefulness rather than reflecting any genuine, unconditional regard for you as a person. The third shocking sign, and often the most disorienting because it happens gradually rather than in a single dramatic moment, an increasing willingness to contradict their own previous statements, sometimes within the same conversation, without any apparent awareness that the contradiction is even happening. Early in a relationship with a narcissist, this kind of inconsistency is usually managed carefully, kept subtle enough to avoid detection. As the performance starts to strain, often once someone has become comfortable enough or unimportant enough that maintaining careful consistency no longer feels necessary, these contradictions start becoming more frequent, more obvious, and increasingly unconcerned with whether they get noticed at all. This is shocking because it reveals something crucial about how the narcissist's relationship to truth actually functions underneath the performance. It was never really about accurately representing a consistent, examined reality. It was always about serving whatever narrative best suited the specific moment, the specific audience, the specific goal, with truth itself treated as flexible, secondary, entirely subordinate to whatever framing currently feels most advantageous. Watching this pattern become increasingly visible, increasingly unconcerned with its own inconsistency, often produces a genuine disorienting realization. The entire relationship has, in some sense, been conducted with someone whose relationship to truth was never what it originally appeared to be. I want to talk about why these three signs specifically tend to appear together in a cluster rather than showing up as isolated, unrelated incidents, because understanding this clustering explains why the reveal, once it starts, tends to accelerate rather than remain stable at a low, occasional level. All three signs share the same underlying cause. The effort required to maintain the original performance has, for some reason, become harder to sustain, or less worthwhile to continue sustaining. And once that effort starts to lapse in one domain, it tends to lapse across all three simultaneously, because they were never actually separate behaviors requiring separate management. They were always facets of the same underlying management system. And once that system starts straining, the strain shows up across multiple fronts at once, rather than remaining neatly contained to a single, isolated behavior. I want to say something important about why this reveal often catches people off guard, even people who consider themselves fairly perceptive and psychologically aware. The original performance, when it's working well, is genuinely convincing, not because the person witnessing it is naive, but because the performance is specifically designed, whether consciously or through years of reinforced instinct, to be convincing to exactly the kind of perceptive, empathetic people who would otherwise be most likely to notice something was wrong. This means the eventual reveal, when it happens, often produces a very specific kind of disorientation, not simply, "I was wrong about this person," but something more unsettling. I'm generally quite good at reading people, and I still didn't see this clearly until it was already well underway. I want to be honest about something important as we move toward the second half of this conversation. Recognizing these three signs isn't really about assigning blame to yourself for having missed them earlier, and it isn't about becoming permanently suspicious of everyone's warmth or charm going forward. It's about understanding a specific, recognizable pattern clearly enough that the next time something similar starts to surface in any relationship, you'll have language and framework for what you're actually witnessing, rather than continuing to explain it away, minimize it, or assume you must be misreading something that's actually becoming quite clear. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually causes the performance to start cracking at this specific point rather than earlier or later? Why some people never witness this reveal at all despite years of relationship, and what it actually means for you, practically, once you've recognized that this specific unraveling has genuinely begun. Let's talk about what actually causes the performance to start cracking at this specific point, rather than earlier or later, because understanding the trigger explains something important. Why some people witness this reveal within months of knowing a narcissist, while others go years, even decades, without ever seeing behind the carefully maintained image at all. Here's the first and most common trigger: a significant decrease in how much strategic value the audience witnessing the behavior still holds. This connects directly to the second sign we discussed in the first half: the shift in treatment toward people who no longer serve a purpose. The careful management of image and behavior is expensive in terms of ongoing effort, and that expense only makes sense to continue paying as long as the audience receiving the performance remains valuable enough to justify it. A new romantic interest, a new professional connection, someone whose opinion still matters to the narcissist's broader goals, tends to receive the full, carefully maintained performance. Someone who's already committed, already invested, already unlikely to leave regardless of what gets revealed, tends to receive progressively less careful management, simply because the cost-benefit calculation, whether conscious or not, no longer favors continued, expensive performance for an audience whose continued presence no longer requires it. The second trigger, sustained periods of genuine stress that exceed the narcissist's usual capacity to manage the gap between performance and reality. Everyone's capacity for sustained self-management has limits, but a narcissist's capacity, specifically, tends to be unusually dependent on external conditions remaining relatively stable and favorable. Genuine crisis, financial strain, professional failure, health problems, any situation that removes the usual sources of validation and control they depend on to maintain their sense of self tends to strain the performance dramatically, because managing both the actual crisis and the careful presentation of confidence and control simultaneously requires resources that simply aren't available during genuine hardship. This is precisely why people often report seeing a completely different side of someone specifically during difficult periods that, in a healthier person, might actually reveal more character and resilience, but that, in someone whose stability was always externally dependent, tend to reveal exactly the opposite. The third trigger, and one worth understanding carefully, aging, and the specific way it interacts with a narcissist's usual sources of supply and validation. We discussed this in an earlier episode about the collapse of a narcissist's supply chain over time. As easy, uncritical sources of admiration become harder to access with age, the effort required to maintain the same level of performance increases, while the actual resources available to sustain that effort often decrease simultaneously. This combination frequently produces exactly the kind of reveal we're discussing today, not because the underlying character has genuinely changed, but because the sustainable window for hiding it has genuinely narrowed. Now let's talk about why some people never witness this reveal at all, despite years, sometimes decades, of relationship, because this matters enormously for understanding your own experience, whether you've witnessed this pattern or whether you're wondering why you haven't. The first reason: some relationships never actually reach a point of sufficient security, from the narcissist's perspective, for the performance to relax. If someone remains genuinely uncertain throughout an entire relationship, whether their continued investment and admiration is guaranteed, the narcissist may maintain careful performance indefinitely, simply because the perceived risk of losing that specific audience never actually decreases enough to justify letting the management lapse. This often happens in relationships with significant power imbalances, where one person's continued investment feels genuinely uncertain or hard-won throughout the entire relationship's duration. The second reason: some people are simply never present during the specific conditions likely to produce a reveal: genuine crisis, loss of strategic usefulness, or the compounding pressure of age combined with narrowing supply. Someone who maintains only a peripheral, low-stakes relationship with a narcissist, who never witnesses them during genuine hardship, who remains valuable enough throughout their entire acquaintance to never fall into the no longer useful category, may simply never encounter the specific circumstances required to see behind the performance at all. The third reason, and perhaps the most sobering: some people do witness pieces of this reveal, but successfully explain it away, again and again, because the cost of acknowledging it fully, reassessing an entire relationship, an entire history, an entire investment of years, feels too significant to face directly. This connects to something we've discussed in earlier episodes: recognizing a pattern intellectually and actually allowing yourself to fully believe what you're seeing are two entirely different processes. And plenty of people witness real significant instances of the three signs we've discussed today without ever actually integrating what those instances genuinely reveal. I want to talk now about what it actually means for you practically, once you've recognized that this specific unraveling has genuinely begun, because recognition alone, as we've discussed throughout this series, isn't automatically protective unless it translates into something actionable. The first practical implication: once you've witnessed even one clear instance of any of these three signs, resist the urge to immediately dismiss it as an isolated exception, a bad day, an understandable slip given unusual circumstances. This dismissal is a very natural, very human response, because integrating what the sign actually reveals requires uncomfortable reassessment. But treating a genuine reveal as an isolated incident, rather than as evidence of the underlying pattern it actually represents, tends to reset your own clock of understanding back to zero, requiring you to witness the same reveal multiple additional times before the pattern finally fully registers, when a single clear instance, properly understood, often contains everything you actually need to know. The second practical implication: Use what you've witnessed to recalibrate your expectations going forward, rather than treating each subsequent instance as a fresh, separate disappointment requiring its own fresh explanation. Once you understand that the performance was always a performance, and that what you're now seeing is simply what happens when maintaining that performance becomes less worthwhile or less sustainable, subsequent instances of the same pattern become confirming evidence rather than shocking new information, which changes your entire relationship to how much energy you spend processing and reprocessing each new occurrence. The third practical implication, and the one that matters most for your own well-being, understand that witnessing this reveal doesn't obligate you to confront it directly, doesn't require you to try to fix or address the underlying pattern, and doesn't mean you need to extract some kind of acknowledgement or accountability before you're allowed to act on what you now understand. The reveal itself is simply information, and what you do with that information is entirely your own decision, made according to your own timeline, your own needs, and your own assessment of what continuing this relationship in light of what you now understand is actually worth to you. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture an elaborate stage set built for a long-running production, beautifully constructed, carefully lit, maintained meticulously for every single performance, convincing enough that audiences, night after night, forget entirely that they're looking at painted canvas and careful carpentry rather than an actual solid world. For a long time, this set holds up perfectly because it's being tended constantly, repainted before any wear becomes visible, reinforced before any weakness shows, managed with exactly the kind of ongoing, invisible effort required to keep an illusion convincing indefinitely. But every set, however well maintained, requires resources to sustain, time, materials, ongoing attention from someone willing to keep investing in its upkeep. And there comes a point, in any sufficiently long-running production, where that investment starts to lapse, sometimes because the production itself is winding down, sometimes because the person responsible for maintenance has simply run out of resources to keep investing at the same level, sometimes because the audience watching has become familiar enough, unimportant enough, that maintaining a flawless illusion for them specifically no longer feels worth the effort it costs. And when that lapse finally happens, it rarely happens gracefully, all at once, in some dramatic collapse. It happens in small, accumulating ways. A painted backdrop starting to peel at the edges. A support beam creaking under weight it's carried 1,000 times before without incident. A piece of furniture revealing suddenly, under slightly different lighting, that it was never actually solid at all, just careful painted surface arranged to look that way from exactly the right angle. Once you've seen behind one piece of the set like this, even a small piece, even once, you can never quite watch the rest of the production the same way again. The illusion may continue, technically, functioning well enough for anyone still watching from a comfortable distance. But you know now, in a way you can't unknow, exactly what the whole elaborate structure was actually made of underneath. And no amount of careful lighting or convincing performance is ever going to fully restore the illusion you once genuinely believed in. That knowledge, uncomfortable as it is, was never actually a loss. It was simply finally the truth, arriving exactly when the performance could no longer afford to keep it hidden any longer.